In the early days before the events that would later ripple through courthouse ledgers, local gossip circuits, and the half-whispered recollections of those who survived that volatile season along the Ohio River, the rural stretches of Henderson County lay under a slow, oppressive sky. Dawn arrived reluctantly, filtered through a gray veil of river fog that moved with the lethargy of something wounded and old, as though the landscape itself resented the coming of another day. The tobacco barns, long, skeletal structures built from weather-scarred timber, stood in uneven rows that suggested both order and decay, their planks stained with years of curing smoke and the sweat of the enslaved who labored within. The cabins, clustered on the lower slopes near the drainage gullies, sagged as if pressed down by invisible hands, and their chimneys exhaled thin columns of smoke that the damp air quickly smothered. Roosters crowed sporadically, never in unison, as though uncertain whether morning had truly come. It was in this environment, at once familiar to its inhabitants and suffocating in its monotony, that Elias moved with the slow certainty of a man accustomed to being watched, weighed, and whispered about, yet never openly challenged. Those who observed him from the veranda of the main house often spoke of him in contradictory tones. The overseer Morgan called him too quiet for his own good, while Mrs. Abernathy, the mistress of the plantation, remarked during a tea with neighboring families that there was something unsettling in his manner, too steady, as if calculating some private sum. But the field hands had a different understanding. To them, Elias embodied a kind of quiet pressure in the air, a presence both reassuring and dangerous. He was tall, but not unusually so, strong, but not to the extent that strength alone would mark him as a threat. What singled him out was the way he carried his silence, deliberately, like a tool sharpened over many years, and the way he watched scenes unfold around him with careful attention. Children whispered that he never bowed his head fully toward anyone. Adults said little about that, but they noticed it nonetheless. It was not insolence, not overt defiance, but something subtler, a refusal of that small symbolic surrender that people in their condition were expected to perform without thinking. And it was from this refusal, quiet and nearly invisible, that much of the unease surrounding him originated. The hierarchy of the plantation, rigid and ritualized, exerted its influence even before the sun had cleared the treeline. Overseers' whistles and the hollow bell from the main yard dictated the pace of waking bodies. Footsteps on packed earth formed an uneven rhythm of dread, some quick, some dragging, some hesitant with the hope that a minor illness might excuse a few hours of labor. In the cabins, the air was thick with wood smoke and the murmur of hurried preparations. Women tying cloth around their hair, men pulling on frayed trousers, children blinking sleep away in the half-darkness while holding onto the skirts of their mothers. Elias's presence was often the last to leave the cabins, not because he rose late, but because he stood a moment at the doorway each morning, surveying the fog-cloaked fields with an expression that no one dared interpret aloud. His gaze traveled across the rows of drying tobacco, the muddy paths leading toward the river, and the silhouette of the courthouse tower barely visible through the mist. He studied these landmarks not as a prisoner marking his limits, but as someone mapping a terrain in which every detail, every odor carried meaning. In the fields, the days unfolded with the monotony of grinding labor punctuated by the overseer's barks, the snap of switches breaking stalks or striking flesh, and the low throb of machinery in the sheds. The tobacco leaves rustled in the humid breeze with the sound of soft, reluctant applause. Elias worked in near silence, his movements measured and almost ritualistic, as though each task was an act of deliberate observation rather than simple obedience. Other enslaved workers often glanced his way, not for guidance. Elias was not the type to give overt instruction, but because his presence seemed to alter the atmosphere around him. Even Morgan, who prided himself on breaking any hint of independence among the enslaved, found himself hesitant when addressing Elias, lowering his voice to a scolding murmur rather than the typical bark of command. Yet beneath the outward order, small tensions stirred. The damp air seemed to amplify every whisper, and the fog, clinging stubbornly to the fields, turned each shape into something vague and watchful. Rumors moved through the quarters like nervous animals, stories of a shift in local politics, murmurs about abolitionist pamphlets discovered near river docks, the disappearance of a young, enslaved man from a neighboring plantation, and the arrival of a new traveler in town who claimed to be selling farm tools but asked too many questions about night patrols. On certain evenings, when the dusk pressed early upon the cabins and the frogs along the marshes began their droning chorus, the workers shared uneasy glances, sensing that the ordinary dangers of their days were being joined by something larger, more unpredictable. It was during one such dusk that a small incident occurred, trivial enough that it went unrecorded in any official document, yet significant enough that those who witnessed it remembered the moment long after. Elias, carrying a bundle of cut stalks toward the curing shed, paused beside a water trough where a young boy, Samuel, knelt to rinse mud from his hands. The overseer Morgan approached with his usual expression of irritated vigilance. He reprimanded the boy for lingering too long and raised his switch in a gesture meant more to intimidate than to inflict pain. Elias, still holding the bundle, shifted his stance by no more than an inch, just enough for Morgan to register the movement. It was not an act of defense, nor a direct challenge. Any overt resistance would have been disastrous, but a faint, instinctive adjustment, like a tall tree leaning slightly to block the wind from a sapling. Morgan hesitated, his arm lowered. He muttered something indistinct, then walked off toward the barn with hurried stiffness, as if embarrassed by his moment of hesitation. Samuel looked up at Elias with wide, bewildered eyes, but Elias said nothing, only resumed his path with the same deliberate pace as before. That one movement, a shift of weight, a momentary stillness, would later be recalled by Samuel in adulthood as the first sign that the balance of fear on the plantation was beginning to tilt. In the days that followed, a strange restlessness took hold among both enslaved laborers and white residents. The air grew heavier, the river fog lingering until well past midday, and the winds from the west carried the smell of decaying vegetation mixed with something metallic, like rusting iron. In town, merchants speculated about the upcoming election day, predicting boisterous celebrations, drunken brawls, and the usual display of power meant to remind the enslaved population of their place. In the quarters, the workers spoke little about the election itself. They knew better than to concern themselves with affairs that held no promise for them, but they felt its approach in the sharpening tempers of the overseers and the more frequent visits from patrols who carried lanterns that flickered like restless spirits in the night. One evening, while the cabins settled into their familiar chorus of muffled conversation, crackling fires, and weary breaths, an incident occurred that marked the first quiet fracture in the plantation's routine. A scrap of paper, no larger than a hand, was found wedged between the slats of the storage shed, an unfamiliar object in a place where nothing extraneous was ever left unnoticed. It bore only a few smudged words, written in hurried graphite. "They are coming sooner than expected." The handwriting was crude, suggesting someone with limited schooling, yet the message carried an unsettling urgency. The workers who discovered it said nothing, for to speak of such a paper was to invite suspicion, punishment, or worse. They buried it under a pile of discarded stalks near the ditch. But someone had seen Elias near the shed shortly before the discovery, and though no one accused him, the knowledge passed from person to person with the weight of an omen. As the plantation braced itself for the approaching political festivities, the small, almost imperceptible signs of social unease multiplied. Mrs. Abernathy began urging the kitchen staff to maintain tighter inventories of food and tools, muttering to her husband that she had felt watched while walking near the smokehouse. The master himself, a man prone to nervous chewing of his pipe stem, instructed Morgan to increase night patrols and ensure that no one from outside the plantation, particularly river men with loose morals, wandered near the quarters. Their precautions, while outwardly justified by the rumors circulating through the county, revealed an underlying anxiety that had begun to seep into the very bones of the estate. And though Elias's role in this shift was never openly acknowledged, there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when the master's gaze lingered on him a fraction too long, as though trying to decipher a threat he could sense but not articulate. All the while, Elias himself moved with the same deliberate quiet as before, his thoughts inaccessible to those around him. Yet there was something altered in the air around him, a subtle tightening, like the first pull on a rope that no one had realized was wrapped around multiple necks. His interactions with the others remained minimal, but his presence seemed to command greater attention. Workers fell silent when he passed, pressing their lips together as though afraid that a careless word might draw unwanted notice. Some avoided meeting his eyes, others sought them briefly, hoping for a sign of reassurance or warning. Elias offered neither. His silence grew heavier, not in hostility but in contemplation, as though he carried within him a ledger of calculations too complex for those around him to imagine. It was during these days that Morgan, increasingly uneasy, began observing Elias from a distance. He noted the way Elias's gaze lingered on the river path, the curing sheds, and the open fields that led toward the county road. He noted, too, that Elias's influence among the workers, though never openly expressed, seemed to deepen with each passing day. When one of the younger overseers, a brash man named Whitlock, mocked Elias for his silence, several of the field hands stiffened, their expressions darkening in a manner that Whitlock noticed only belatedly. No blow was struck, no word exchanged, but the atmosphere shifted enough for Whitlock to retreat with a forced laugh and an awkward pat on his own belt knife, as if reassuring himself of his authority. He reported the incident to Morgan, who shrugged it off yet privately resolved to keep a closer watch. The turning point, though still subtle, arrived one late afternoon when the sky had turned a murky copper hue and the air smelled of distant rain. Elias, returning from the fields with a bundle of tools that needed repair, paused near the edge of the woods where the shadows thickened prematurely. There, half buried beneath a tangle of roots, he noticed a small tin badge, bent, dulled, and marked with the emblem of the county patrol. Such badges were not normally found in the woods, and certainly not this close to the quarters. Elias studied it for a long moment, the distant caws of crows echoing through the trees like warnings. He did not touch the badge. Instead, he left it where it lay and walked back toward the main yard with a measured pace. Later that night, a patrolman was overheard in town complaining that one of his men had gone missing during a routine circuit. His comments were brushed aside by his drinking companions, who chalked the man's absence up to drunkenness or desertion. But the next morning, when Morgan heard the rumor, he cast a brief, cautious glance toward Elias in the fields, a glance that Elias returned without expression. Thus the early days of the narrative settled into a pattern of heavy skies, taut silences, and a gathering sense of something unspoken swelling beneath the ordinary cruelty of rural Kentucky life. Though no one could yet identify the nature of the shift, it was clear to all, overseers, workers, and even those who pretended not to see, that the balance of power was trembling, stretched thin by the weight of too many secrets, too many fears, and the quiet, unsettling presence of a man who had never bowed his head. In the days that followed the strange find in the woods and the quiet shift in Morgan's watchfulness, the atmosphere across the plantation thickened into something almost tactile, like a second skin of humidity that clung to every movement and every breath. The fog no longer waited for dawn but seeped across the fields even at midday, curling along the tobacco rows in pale ribbons that obscured the horizon. Election Day, which had always loomed in the background as a noisy spectacle of white celebration and coerced black compliance, now cast a longer, more menacing shadow. Preparations for the festivities had begun in the big house. Barrels of cider rolled across the porch, crates of cheese and smoked pork delivered from town, and garlands of autumn leaves hung around the veranda railings. Yet beneath the surface of these ritualized procedures buzzed an unmistakable note of tension, as though the entire plantation were holding its breath in anticipation of something far less festive. The enslaved workers sensed this change with the instinctual clarity of those who had spent their lives reading the moods of others for survival. Conversations in the cabins grew shorter, sharper, and more frequently interrupted by cautious glances at the door. The sound of footsteps outside, whether belonging to an overseer, a patrolman, or merely a stray dog, could silence a room in an instant. Even the children, usually quick to resume their games after a reprimand, grew unusually subdued, their laughter stifled and hesitant, as though they feared it might attract unwanted attention. Sundays, which had once offered a brief illusion of rest, now brought little relief. Instead, the hours away from the fields provided too much time for thoughts to ferment, for whispers to circulate, for suspicions to take root in corners where candlelight barely reached. Elias, for his part, remained as steady as ever, though the quiet around him tightened like a noose with each passing day. He continued his work with the same deliberate precision, yet something in his posture had hardened, a subtle straightening of the spine, a sharpening of his gaze. He studied the plantation not with curiosity but with assessment, as though noting weaknesses in its structure, tallying routes and routines, marking which overseers were careless, which ones predictable, and which ones had begun to suspect something but lacked the clarity to pinpoint its source. Morgan was the most vigilant of them all, pacing along the fence line at dusk with a lantern swinging from his hand, his gaze darting toward the woods more often than toward the workers he was supposed to monitor. The younger overseers tended toward bluster, snapping at the enslaved with increasing irritability, their voices cracking in ways that revealed their own nerves. Whitlock in particular seemed determined to re-establish dominance, though he did so with an overeager cruelty that betrayed deep insecurity rather than authority. It was during one such demonstration of false confidence that the first minor confrontation occurred, subtle yet sharp enough to stir unease among all who witnessed it. Whitlock, walking the rows in the late afternoon with his whip coiled loosely in his hand, noticed two workers exchanging a whispered remark while bending to tie bundles of leaves. His approach was swift, fueled by a need to reassert the hierarchy he felt slipping through his fingers. "Talking on my time?" he snapped, raising the whip in a theatrical flourish meant to impress Morgan, who watched from a distance with crossed arms. The two workers froze, but before Whitlock could bring the whip down, Elias stepped between them, not directly, but with a slow, deliberate movement that placed his shadow across their bodies. He did not touch Whitlock, did not speak, did not even look at him. He merely straightened the binding of his own bundle, as though oblivious to the tension, though the timing of his action left no doubt about its intent. Whitlock hesitated, uncertain whether Elias was challenging him. The hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Morgan barked at Whitlock to leave the theatrics for Election Day, and the matter dispersed into the dust of the fields. Yet the residue of the moment lingered, a hairline crack in the unyielding facade of authority. The enslaved felt the tremor of that moment in ways that went unspoken but unmistakably shared. In the men's shed that evening, where they mended tools under dim lanterns, whispers flowed more freely than usual, though always punctuated by wary glances. A few spoke of the strange badge Elias had seen near the woods, though none dared mention it openly. Others recalled the scrap of paper discovered earlier, connecting it, perhaps inaccurately, but with the logic of fear, to the missing patrolman and the increase in night watch activity. Some believed that the paper referred to abolitionists or escape networks moving earlier than anticipated. Others insisted it was a trap, or worse, a sign that trouble from outside would soon crash into their already fragile world. Amid these theories, Elias remained mostly silent, but when he did speak, his voice was low and deliberate, offering neither comfort nor panic. "Watch what you hear," he murmured at one point, not looking up from the blade he was sharpening. Words travel faster than footsteps. It was not a warning so much as a reminder of the fine line they all walked, a line that was growing thinner by the day. Meanwhile, in the big house, the Abernathy family rehearsed the choreography of Election Day with anxious precision. Mr. Abernathy was preoccupied with maintaining appearances of political dominance, frequently inviting neighboring planters to discuss voting blocks and county influence. Their conversations grew louder with each tankard of cider, peppered with boasts about the turnout they expected to command, turnout inflated by the forced transport of enslaved men to polling sites, where their presence, though legally barred from voting, was used as a symbolic reinforcement of white supremacy. Mrs. Abernathy, who took particular pride in the annual displays of plantation orderliness, directed the kitchen staff with increasing rigidity, insisting that every platter and every pitcher be arranged just so, as though the aesthetics of abundance could mask the growing rot beneath the social order. It was during one of these rehearsals that an overheard fragment of conversation planted a dangerous seed of information. A maid, sweeping near the parlor door late in the evening, caught a slurred comment from one of the visiting planters about the patrols tightening on the far river bend and a man they suspect of carrying news from Cincinnati. The maid, whose sister worked in the quarters, repeated this fragment in hushed tones the next morning, and within hours the information, distorted, sharpened by fear, reached the ears of several workers who assumed the man from Cincinnati was somehow connected to the paper found earlier. The idea that an outsider was slipping through patrol lines ignited both hope and dread. Hope that escape or change might be possible, dread that suspicion would soon turn inward, toward them. This mixture of fear and longing created fertile ground for the beginnings of a plan, though to call it a plan at this stage was perhaps too generous. It was more a contour, an outline drawn in the air by glances and shared silences. Small adjustments in routine occurred. Elias began walking the long way around the curing shed to reach the fields, passing near the boundary where the badge had been found. A few workers lingered a moment longer at the well under the pretext of fetching water, their conversations blending with the creak of the bucket. The women who worked in the kitchen exchanged knowing looks when Mrs. Abernathy mentioned the increase in patrols. And in the men's shed, someone began scratching faint marks along the wooden beams, marks that at first looked like accidental gouges, but eventually formed a pattern recognizable only to those who paid close attention. It was a map, though one rendered in the simplest code, marking routes, timings, and vulnerabilities. Yet even as the outline of a plan took shape, the danger grew sharper. One evening, during tool repair, a young man named Isaac faltered under pressure, his voice trembling as he speculated too loudly about potential opportunities during the election chaos. Two older men immediately shushed him, but the damage was done. A shadow outside the shed moved away too quickly to be coincidence. Someone had overheard. By morning, Whitlock was making rounds near the shed with a self-satisfied swagger, tapping his belt knife against his thigh, as if rehearsing some imagined punishment. Isaac avoided eye contact for the rest of the day, fear radiating from him like heat. Elias watched him quietly during the noon break, then approached him later with a question so calm it seemed almost gentle. "Do you understand now?" Isaac nodded, unable to speak. "Then let it teach you, not break you," Elias said, and walked away. But secrets rarely travel in straight lines, and this one reached ears it should not have. By midweek, Mrs. Abernathy mentioned to her husband that the workers seemed restless, as if waiting for some signal, and he, already unnerved by the county gossip of abolitionist activity, demanded that Morgan conduct random cabin searches. The searches turned up nothing, of course. The workers had grown skilled at concealing anything of value or suspicion. But the intrusion itself inflamed the underlying tension, stirring anger and dread in equal measure. A few women wept quietly as their belongings were tossed aside. One man clenched his jaw so tightly that blood seeped from the inside of his cheek. Morgan, uncomfortable with the entire endeavor, performed the searches with mechanical efficiency, muttering apologies under his breath that satisfied no one, least of all himself. From that point on, the days tightened like a noose. Workers moved carefully, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line or the road leading toward town. At night, lanterns from patrolmen swung like pendulums in the darkness, casting elongated shadows across the cabin walls. The whispers that once carried rumors now carried instructions, simple, repetitive, drilled into memory. Who would be where when the overseers changed shifts, which parts of the yard would be crowded on election day, when the noise of drunken celebrations might cover footsteps or a brief cry. Yet no one knew what Elias intended, not even those who sensed he was at the center of the shifting currents. His silence had grown heavier, his gaze more penetrating, but he shared little. Some thought he planned escape. Others believed he sought something else, something darker. A few feared he was preparing an act that would bring ruin on them all. But none dared question him directly. His presence had transcended ordinary influence. He had become the still point around which all their anxieties revolved. The final turning point came late one night when the wind roared across the fields with unusual ferocity, sending loose leaves swirling like sparks from an unseen fire. Elias slipped out of his cabin and walked toward the curing shed, moving with the certainty of one who knew he would not be followed. He paused near the shadowed corner where the map marks had been carved into the beam. He traced them with his fingers, then added a new line, long, deliberate, unmistakably final. As he stepped back, a figure emerged from the darkness. Morgan. He had no lantern, no whip, only the dim outline of a man who had reached the limits of his uncertainty. The two men regarded each other in the pale moonlight, the wind howling overhead. Morgan opened his mouth as if to speak, but hesitated. Elias did not move, did not blink, simply stood with the unyielding stillness that had made him both feared and respected. After a long, suspended moment, Morgan turned without a word and walked away, his footsteps swallowed by the wind. It was at that moment, silent, tense, irrevocable, that the trajectory of the plantation shifted from simmering unease to something far more volatile. A dangerous secret had indeed reached the wrong ears. A plan, still undefined but undeniably underway, had crossed the threshold from contemplation to inevitability. An election day, once a distant marker on the calendar, now loomed like a storm-gathering force far beyond anyone's control. The weeks that followed the silent encounter between Elias and Morgan passed in a state of suspended dread, each day pressed tightly against the next like pages in a ledger documenting a slow-moving disaster. Nothing happened, nothing visible, nothing that could be articulated, but everyone felt the shift, an atmospheric pressure that settled behind the eyes and in the joints, making every movement feel heavier, every breath somehow insufficient. Even the air changed. The river humidity grew dense and metallic, clinging to the workers' clothing long after the sun went down, filling the cabins with the sour scent of damp tobacco leaves, sweat-soaked cotton, and wood smoke that refused to drift upward through the chimney flues. Nights became restless, filled with the low murmur of whispered conversations, the scraping of restless feet, and the distant, rhythmic boom of something being built in town: scaffolds, stages, platforms for speeches and public demonstrations that would accompany Election Day. The white world was preparing its spectacle, unaware that beneath its rituals another kind of preparation was underway. Elias moved through this thickened world with a gait so calm it bordered on unnatural, as though he alone remained untouched by the rising panic. But those who watched him closely, especially the elders, who carried long memories of uprisings stifled and rebellions crushed, noticed a subtle but decisive alteration in his behavior. He no longer paused to exchange a word with familiar faces. He no longer deflected questions with the quiet humor that once softened his severity. Instead, his attention moved like a surveying needle across invisible fault lines. The new patrolman stationed near the river bend, the increasing number of men arriving at the Abernathy property under the guise of political meetings, the noise from the iron workshop where chains, locks, and restraints were being serviced at unusual hours. He was not frightened by these signs. He was cataloging them. The first decisive step came on a damp morning when the fog clung low to the ground, blurring the boundaries between the fields and the yard. The workers were preparing the tobacco rafters in the curing shed when a sudden shout erupted outside, sharp, startled, followed by the frantic rustle of boots stumbling through wet grass. By the time the workers emerged into the light, they found Morgan gripping a young boy named Caleb by the arm, shaking him hard enough that his teeth clicked together. Caleb was panting, his eyes wide with panic. In his hand he clutched a strip of paper, one of the coated pieces from the shed beam, torn away, perhaps by accident, perhaps by desperate curiosity. Whitlock arrived moments later, breathless and triumphant, already reaching for his whip. "Caught him sneaking," he announced, though he had no knowledge of the situation. He simply sensed an opportunity. Morgan looked down at the paper, his expression unreadable. The boy began to stammer, claiming he had only been playing, that he didn't know what the marks meant. But Whitlock was not listening. He lifted the whip with a theatrical flourish, the leather arching above his head like a serpent about to strike. What followed unfolded with the slow inevitability of a blade descending. Elias stepped forward, not quickly, not dramatically, not even fully interrupting the scene. He positioned himself between Whitlock and the boy with a stillness so absolute that it momentarily disrupted the overseer's momentum. Elias did not touch the whip. He simply stood there, straight-backed, gaze steady, his body forming an unmoving barrier. The silence that followed rang with an almost physical resonance. Whitlock sputtered with disbelief, his face mottling red, but for one of the first times in his tenure, he hesitated. Morgan tried to intervene, placing a hand on Whitlock's arm and muttering, "Not now. Not like this." But Whitlock jerked away, humiliated by the idea of retreat, especially in front of the workers who watched with wide, fearful eyes. He snapped the whip downward in a vicious arc, only to have Elias catch the leather with his bare hand. The crack echoed across the yard, followed instantly by a hush so deep one could hear the cattle shifting on the far hill. Elias did not flinch. The whip dangled between them for a moment, a thin, trembling line of tension. Then he released it without a word and walked away, leaving Whitlock staring after him, shaken, exposed. Morgan knelt by Caleb, whispering something urgent that the boy would later claim he did not understand. The workers dispersed in near silence, though the echo of their racing thoughts filled the humid air. It was the first direct confrontation, muted, controlled, but unmistakably a rupture. Though no one spoke of it directly, every worker felt the boundaries shift. And in the big house, the plantation's white inhabitants sensed it too, though their interpretation was distorted by fear, pride, or self-righteousness. Mrs. Abernathy demanded stricter enforcement of discipline, complaining that the workers were too familiar with each other, too restless, too secretive. Mr. Abernathy, who had spent the past month in an alcohol-fueled panic over political rumors, warned Morgan that any further insubordination would be punished swiftly and publicly, preferably on Election Day itself, when the spectacle would reinforce white authority in front of allies and rivals alike. Morgan nodded obediently, but his jaw tightened in a way that suggested he was swallowing something bitter. He had seen the confrontation differently, not as a challenge to authority, but as a warning that the entire structure he had spent years upholding was beginning to fracture. As preparations for Election Day reached a fevered pitch, the signs of impending collapse multiplied. Patrolmen grew increasingly aggressive, stopping anyone walking near the property lines, demanding explanations for harmless tasks. Workers caught alone were questioned, sometimes beaten, more often threatened with vague punishments meant to instill paranoia rather than obedience. The kitchen women reported that Mrs. Abernathy had taken to locking the pantry, convinced that the workers were stealing or sabotaging supplies. A few men were reassigned to tasks that made no sense, hauling firewood to the barn loft, only to haul it back to the yard the next day. Actions that revealed disorder in the management rather than strategy. In the cabins, moral fractures deepened. Some argued that Elias was putting them all in danger, that his silence and severity were dragging them toward disaster. Others believed he was the only one who understood how to navigate the tightening grip of white authority, that he had seen something, some possibility or inevitability they were not yet prepared to face. Arguments erupted over nothing, a misplaced tool, a broken bowl, a missing blanket. The pressure inside each cabin grew so intense that even small misfortunes sparked accusations. One night, an elderly man named Turner confronted a younger worker he suspected of informing on him, and the ensuing scuffle left both men bleeding. When Elias entered the cabin and separated them, he said nothing, but his expression conveyed a sorrow so deep that Turner later wept alone in the dark, ashamed of what he had become under pressure. The psychological strain was mirrored by physical hardships. The nights grew colder. The barn smelled of mold and damp straw. The workers' clothes clung to their skin after long hours in the humidity, chafing their shoulders until the skin cracked. Wood smoke seeped into their lungs, making their breath shallow and wheezing. Even the animals sensed the rising panic. Horses snorted nervously. Chickens squawked at the slightest movement. Dogs patrolled with their hackles raised, as though expecting violence. It was in this fevered atmosphere that the second turning point occurred, subtle yet profoundly destabilizing. Late one evening, as the workers prepared to sleep, a knock sounded at the door of Elias's cabin. 3 sharp raps, followed by one long scrape. It was a signal used by those who trusted him. Outside stood a woman named Mariah, her face drawn, her eyes reflecting a misery she struggled to articulate. In her hand, she held a cloth-wrapped bundle. When she unwrapped it, Elias saw a small brass key and a folded piece of parchment covered in hurried handwriting. Mariah explained that she had been cleaning Mr. Abernathy's study when she overheard him discussing preparations for Election Day punishment displays. The parchment contained a list of names, workers deemed potential threats, to be restrained and showcased in front of guests. The brass key belonged to the iron shackles stored in the barn, recently inspected and oiled. Her name was on the list. So was Morgan's. Elias studied the parchment for a long time. When he finally looked up, something inside him had hardened, crystallized into certainty. Mariah sensed it and began to cry, not out of fear, but out of the painful recognition that whatever he intended would cost them dearly. Elias told her, in a voice low enough to be swallowed by the darkness, "You must choose now who you stand with. After tonight, there is no turning back." She nodded, though tears continued to fall down her face. She understood the weight of the key she had delivered, a key that might unlock shackles or unleash consequences no one could survive. The following days unfolded with an almost apocalyptic intensity. Workers stumbled through their tasks, exhausted by sleepless nights, consumed by the knowledge that their names might be inked onto a list of impending humiliation or death. The overseers barked orders with increasing desperation, sensing their authority slip like sand through their fingers. Whitlock took to carrying his whip at all times, even during meals, though the twitch in his eye betrayed how deeply the earlier confrontation had shaken him. Morgan, though outwardly composed, paced the yard each night long after the others had gone to their cabins, as though searching for a future he no longer believed in. By the final week before Election Day, the entire plantation thrummed with tension so tightly coiled it seemed that the slightest misstep would unleash violence. The workers whispered in trembling voices about escape, uprising, sabotage, divine intervention, anything that might break the suffocating cycle. But Elias spoke little. He spent his nights walking the perimeter of the property, his footsteps barely audible on the frost-hardened ground. He studied the guard rotations, the location of the iron restraints, the flow of people to and from the big house. He watched the sky, as though searching for some sign hidden among the low-hanging stars. For the first time, white authority showed visible cracks. Arguments erupted among the Abernathy guests. Rumors of unrest circulated in town. A local preacher accused political rivals of inviting chaos by relying on enslaved labor to swell their influence. The tension among the white men mirrored the quiet panic among the enslaved. The system that had once felt monolithic now trembled, its foundations no longer secure. And through it all, the moral weight pressed down like an unbearable burden. Some workers felt crushing guilt for wanting to survive at any cost. Others felt a growing rage that threatened to consume them. A handful considered offering information to the overseers in exchange for safety, while others contemplated sacrificing themselves to protect those they loved. Survival instincts clashed with loyalties, fear with conscience, hope with despair. By the final night before Election Day, one truth had settled into the bones of every person on the plantation. Something irreversible was coming. Not everyone would survive it. Not everyone would be remembered correctly. And Elias, silent, calculating, burdened by a vision of freedom or vengeance no one fully understood, was finally ready to take his decisive step. In the hours before dawn on Election Day, the air over the valley grew unnaturally still, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The fog had retreated toward the river, leaving behind a thin film of dew that coated the grass like cold sweat. Even the insects were quiet. It was the first silence anyone had heard in weeks, and its unnatural purity set every worker on edge. People moved like shadows between the cabins, whispering uncertain prayers, straightening the frayed hems of their shirts, preparing themselves for the spectacle their enslavers intended to stage: public obedience, ritual humiliation, and the iron clatter of restraints meant to reaffirm power before guests who would arrive drunk on whiskey and certainty. But beneath that orchestrated pageantry, something else was moving, something that pulsed through the soil beneath their feet. Elias woke before the first light, though he had not slept. He sat at the edge of his bunk, elbows on knees, hands steepled in front of his face. He had spent the night listening to the shifting of the dogs, to the creak of wagon wheels being readied, to the nervous murmurs of newly arrived visitors in the main house. But most of all, he had listened to the barn, where Morgan and Whitlock had overseen preparations for the corrective demonstrations, speaking in harsh, clipped tones that betrayed their fear more clearly than their words. When the lanterns in the barn finally dimmed and the overseers returned to the house to sleep off their nerves, Elias rose. His shadow stretched long across the dirt floor, a silhouette as still as a carved monument. He reached for the small brass key Mariah had given him, which he had tied beneath a loose board under his bunk. When his hand closed around it, a subtle but final knot tightened within him. There would be no turning back now, no possibility of returning to the man he had been before this night. Outside, the workers gathered in tense lines. The fog had thinned, and the stars faded into a weak, bluish glow. A wagon rattled into the yard, its wheels grinding over stones with a deliberate slowness that carried an air of impending dread. In the back lay the iron restraints, freshly oiled, gleaming with cold precision. Beside them, a set of wooden stocks rested like an open mouth waiting to swallow someone whole. A few guests wandered from the house, mugs in hand, already drunk enough to laugh at their own jokes. They talked about politics, horses, and the expected turnout, making occasional comments about the entertainment the Abernethys had prepared. Their casual anticipation turned the air thick with sickness. The plantation was bracing for a performance of cruelty. But the overseers, those who were meant to ensure the day's spectacle proceeded smoothly, were not unified. Whitlock strode out first, jaw clenched, whip in hand, his pride still raw from the earlier confrontation with Elias. He barked orders with theatrical authority, though his voice trembled at the edges. Morgan emerged moments later, shoulders hunched, eyes darkened by sleeplessness. His gaze swept across the workers, lingering on Elias with an expression so conflicted that it made several onlookers shiver. Fear, admiration, resentment, and something that resembled sorrow all tangled in the overseer's face, twisting it into a mask he could not control. The workers were ordered into formation. Those whose names had been found on the parchment list, Mariah, Turner, Caleb, and several others, were pushed toward the wagon, where Whitlock uncoiled his whip as though preparing for a feast. The guests gathered like spectators at a traveling show. The Abernathy children clambered onto the porch railing for a better view. Mrs. Abernathy stood poised with her hands clasped tightly, her expression serene, as though this brutality were merely another aspect of household management. As the sun crested the hill, the illusion of festivity reached its peak. Laughter rose from the porch. Someone struck up a fiddle tune. A patrol captain made a loud joke about reminding them who does the voting in this state, and the white men roared with approval. It was precisely the spectacle the Abernethys intended, a public reaffirmation of racial hierarchy before the ballots were cast. But the moment the restraints were lifted from the wagon, cold iron glinting in the morning light, something began to shift. A single dog started barking near the far fence, sharp and unrelenting. The horses in the stable stomped nervously, and Elias, who had stood motionless until this point, stepped forward. Whitlock noticed him immediately and straightened with the eagerness of a man craving revenge. "You," he sneered, lifting his whip. "You come here. Right now." The guests turned their attention toward the confrontation, sensing an opportunity for entertainment. But before Whitlock could reach him, Morgan grabbed his arm, whispering something urgent. Whitlock shoved him away. "He thinks he can stand between me and the law," he spat. "I'll show him exactly." He didn't finish, because Elias did not wait. He walked with quiet, deliberate steps toward the wagon, not toward Whitlock, not toward Morgan, but toward the iron restraints themselves. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The workers stiffened, breath caught in their throats. Elias reached into his pocket and withdrew the brass key. And then, In a moment so swift it felt like an exhalation, he unlocked one of the shackles and let it fall to the dirt. A gasp tore through the assembled crowd. Not loud, but sharp, shocked, the sound of a boundary rupturing. Whitlock lunged forward, but Morgan caught him again, harder this time. "Leave it," Morgan hissed, though his voice shook. "Don't you see what's happening? He's daring us to act, right in front of them." He nodded toward the guests, whose drunken bravado had begun to falter as they sensed the atmosphere shifting. But Whitlock, humiliated beyond reason, ripped himself free and charged at Elias. His whip slashed the air, striking across Elias's shoulder with a crack so violent it sent birds erupting from the trees. Elias didn't turn. He grabbed the shackle again, unlocked the second clasp, and let it drop beside the first. Whitlock roared and raised the whip a second time. This time, Elias caught it with a speed that made several men step backward. He pulled. Whitlock stumbled forward, off balance, his feet scraping against the dirt. Elias stepped aside and let the overseer collapse face first into the wagon wheel. The guests erupted, some shouting for order, some shouting for punishment, others frozen in horrified fascination. The workers began to move, not in rebellion, not yet, but in a ripple of shifting weight and widening eyes, as though they were rediscovering their own limbs. Morgan, breathless, approached Elias with an expression between pleading and despair. His voice broke as he whispered, "You don't understand what they'll do. You don't understand what you're starting." Elias met his gaze for the first time in weeks. The quiet authority in his eyes made Morgan's knees weaken. "I understand exactly," Elias said. And then the barn door swung open. Inside, the iron tools, chains, locks, restraining rings, had been tampered with during the night. Someone had cut the securing brackets with a handsaw, leaving the tools dangling uselessly. A bucket of oil had been overturned intentionally, soaking the floorboards. The wooden stocks had been partially dismantled. It was sabotage, strategic, deliberate, unmistakable. Mrs. Abernathy screamed. Someone shouted to fetch the patrol. A guest drew a pistol, but Morgan tackled the man before he could aim it, yelling that shooting in front of the workers would send the entire yard into chaos. Whitlock, scrambling to his feet with dirt smeared across his face, bellowed for everyone to freeze, though his voice cracked with panic. The festive illusion shattered. As the crowd surged in confusion, Elias made his irreversible choice. He stepped toward Whitlock with a calmness that froze the overseer in place. Whitlock reached for his gun, but Elias was faster. In one swift motion, using the very shackle he had unlocked, he struck Whitlock across the temple. The overseer collapsed to the ground, his skull cracking against the wagon's axle. Silence. A silence too deep, too absolute, too final. Whitlock did not rise. A woman screamed. A guest dropped his mug. Morgan staggered backward, gripping his hair, whispering no, 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 as though the world had split open beneath him. The yard erupted, not into rebellion, not yet, but into chaotic fear. Guests tripped over themselves trying to flee toward the house. Mrs. Abernathy shrieked for someone to fetch the sheriff. The Abernathy children sobbed and ran toward their mother. The patrolman at the property line rushed in with weapons drawn, shouting conflicting orders. The workers froze, trapped between terror and a dawning realization that nothing would ever be the same. Elias stood over Whitlock's body, chest rising and falling with controlled breath. His hands were steady. His gaze swept across the yard, meeting the eyes of workers and overseers alike. "You wanted a spectacle," he said, his voice carrying across the broken silence. "Now you have one." Morgan, trembling, whispered, "They'll burn this place to the ground. They'll hang every one of you. God help us, Elias, they'll kill everyone." Elias looked at him with a sorrow so deep it carved new lines into his face. "They were going to do that anyway," he said. What followed happened in heartbeats, a blur of terrified movement. Patrolmen lunged toward Elias. Workers surged forward instinctively, some trying to shield him, others trying to pull him back. The first blow landed on the wrong man. A patrol captain struck Turner in the confusion, mistaking him for Elias. Caleb screamed as another patrolman grabbed him by the hair. Mariah swung a wooden bucket at one of the patrol's heads, shattering it and sending him stumbling. And suddenly, the yard was no longer a stage. It was a battlefield. The chain Elias held became a weapon again, but not one he used indiscriminately. He moved with cold precision, striking only those who lunged for him or the unarmed workers. His movements were not wild. They were controlled, purposeful, relentless. Morgan tried to pull the patrolman back, shouting that killing the workers would destroy the Abernathy reputation, that they needed witnesses alive, that the courts would demand testimony. His voice cracked repeatedly, but no one listened. Within minutes, 3 men lay on the ground. Whitlock unconscious or dead, 2 patrolmen injured. Several guests fled toward the road. A few hid in the house, bolting the doors behind them. Election day had collapsed into terror. The air thickened with dust, sweat, and the metallic scent of blood. The festive decorations, a banner strung across the porch, a row of cider barrels lined up for guests, looked obscene against the violent chaos unfolding beneath them. The fiddle lay forgotten on the porch stairs, and the workers, paralyzed by fear and awe, watched as Elias stood in the center of the yard, chest heaving, face unreadable. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. His expression was carved from grief. He had crossed the line. There was no returning, no forgiveness, no survival unless the world broke with him. As the first distant bells from town rang, summoning citizens to vote, Elias lifted his head and whispered a single sentence, so softly that only those nearest him heard. It begins now. The day that was meant to affirm white supremacy had instead become the moment it faltered, cracked, and revealed its terror-slicked bones. And nothing, not law, not fear, not prayer, could undo what had been done. In the days immediately following the breakdown of Election Day, the shattered bunting still hanging in wet tatters from the courthouse rails, the mud around the back steps still holding the prints of men who had run without purpose or direction, the county seemed unable to articulate what precisely had occurred or who was to blame, as though the entire landscape were suffering from a kind of civic aphasia. Official statements, if they could be called that, came haltingly from the magistrates who gathered in tight-lipped circles in the judge's office, producing handwritten summaries that contradicted each other in both detail and tone. One described a small but troubling disruption instigated by unknown Negro malefactors, while another warned of a coordinated act of sedition, and yet a third insisted the whole matter was a tragic misunderstanding exaggerated by the passions of the day. But none of these documents mentioned Elias by name, a fact whispered about in the taverns as a sign that the men who claimed to hold authority found themselves suddenly unsure of how much they should allow to enter the record. Without an agreed-upon narrative, the county retreated into strained routines. Overseers walked the fields in uneasy silence, visibly flinching whenever a host struck stone. Women on porches lowered their voices when a rider passed, and everywhere the fog off the Ohio River settled like an unwanted memory, dulling the edges of barns, trees, and human recollection alike. Only in the slave quarters did clarity, grim and heavy, settle with any firmness, for the enslaved knew with a dreadful precision what had been paid and what had been lost, even if they dared not speak Elias's name aloud in the first days after. Some claimed he had been taken and killed before dawn on the morning after the riot. Others insisted he had escaped into the river timber and vanished like a figure in a folk tale. And still others believed, more quietly, that he had turned himself in to prevent further reprisals against those who'd stood too close to him in the preceding months. Yet no body was displayed, no announcement was made, and no patrol reported finding so much as a melted scrap of iron from his shackles. In the absence of evidence, the silence grew heavier, more authoritative than any decree could ever be. As the weeks stretched forward, the plantation's daily rhythms resumed, but something fundamental had shifted in the moral gravity of the place, as though every path, every work song, every clatter of the wagon wheels bore the weight of an invisible ledger newly rearranged. Overseer Holcomb, wounded in the shoulder on election day and limping from the injury to his thigh, returned with a face more taut than before and with a voice that cracked unexpectedly whenever he issued orders, as if he were attempting to steady himself by sounding decisive. He tried to resume the patterns of discipline he had once wielded effortlessly. Quick inspections, surprise punishments, the calculating stare that assessed submissiveness at a glance. But now each gesture carried the faint tremor of a man who had seen, however briefly, the collapse of the system he believed immovable. Meanwhile, among the enslaved workers, conversations became short, coded, and freighted with the risk of implication. One man, Josiah, who had been seen speaking to Elias in the weeks leading up to the event, was permitted to return to field work after a brief disappearance that no one dared inquire about. His silence, more than anything else, became a warning. Some women carried news from the big house to the quarters in small, folded fragments. Overheard arguments between the Planter brothers, a note burned in the kitchen stove before its contents were fully understood, a visitor from the militia who arrived to inquire, and stayed only long enough to confirm nothing conclusive would be written. A few men whispered confessions at night, telling their wives they wished they had acted differently, that they should have stopped Elias or joined him more fully, depending on the teller and the hour. Mothers kept their children from wandering near the barn where one of the overseers had bled out, afraid that the place itself had become cursed by what had happened. And through it all the tobacco fields grew darker in color, heavy with early frost and late-season rot, the plants slumping as if mirroring the exhaustion that ran through every living soul in the county. The strange thing, noted by a traveling preacher who passed through at the end of the month, was that no one seemed to want the truth, not the whole of it. Instead, they nursed fragments like tender wounds, each person choosing the version of events that best allowed them to keep breathing without breaking. It was in the courthouse basement, among ledgers left half open and stacks of depositions that no clerk wanted to finish, that the first attempt at burying the truth took tangible form. The sheriff, a worn man with thinning hair and a habit of pinching the bridge of his nose before speaking, suggested that the official report mention only electoral unrest rather than referencing the uprising directly. His deputies agreed, not out of cowardice, but out of a desperate wish to avoid the repercussions that a more honest account would demand: militia intervention, public trials, interrogations that would drag neighbors into conflict with one another. The planter elite, once confident in their control, now feared how fragile they might appear to surrounding counties if word spread that one slave, one man, had managed to unsettle the entire structure of Election Day. And so the documents that survived from that period are filled with ellipses, vague references to disturbance, unforeseen violence, a regrettable incident, all phrases that shrink from the reality that Elias's act had shattered the illusion of inevitability that underpinned the slaveholding order. Meanwhile, in the quarters, testimony night, an informal gathering held every few years when grief accumulated past the point of silence, was revived earlier than tradition dictated. Elder women lit tallow candles and placed them in a line along the packed earth floor. Men sat with bowed heads, and one by one those who had been closest to Elias attempted to articulate what had driven him, though each voice faltered when trying to describe the precise mixture of fury, righteousness, despair, and human dignity that had burned in him in the final days. Some insisted he had acted for all of them, a gesture of sacrifice. Others whispered he had doomed them to harsher scrutiny. And some, especially the older ones, insisted that no living man had shaped events alone, that something older, something like the slow grinding of history, had been moving beneath the surface of their world for years, and Elias had merely been the first to step into the open when the weight became unbearable. Whatever the explanation, the stories from that night were never written down, though echoes of them survive in the faint oral traditions that surfaced decades later, when the county had changed beyond recognition and yet still flinched whenever a conversation turned to the old courthouse square. By the time winter spread a thin crust of ice along the riverbanks and the chimneys of the plantation houses exhaled long, white plumes into the brittle air, the community had reached its unspoken decision. Elias would be remembered without being named. Children of the slaveholders were told of troubles many years later, their parents' voices growing stiff as they circled vague warnings about obedience and order. Enslaved families told their children different stories, ones in which a man whose name they did not repeat had stepped into a storm he could not possibly survive, not for glory, but because the boundary between endurance and eruption had finally collapsed. The cost of his act became clear in the punishments that followed: stricter patrols at night, heavier chains for those deemed influential, surveillance that stretched into the smallest corners of daily life. Yet alongside this tightening came, paradoxically, an erosion of moral certainty among the white residents. The planters spoke less loudly about hierarchy and destiny, and in church on Sundays their prayers became more desperate, more self-accusatory, as though they feared that divine judgment had been invited into their midst by the blood spilled on election day. Some families attempted to push the memory away entirely, hosting dances, repairing fences, commissioning new portraits to adorn their parlor walls, anything to reassert a sense of normalcy. But the land itself refused to cooperate. The fields produced a weaker crop than usual. A series of storms damaged the northern barns, and the river flooded unexpectedly late in the season, leaving silt deposits that seemed to outline the shape of footprints leading away from the deck where some believed Elias had last been seen. Whether coincidence or omen, the events deepened the feeling that the county was living under a shadow of unresolved moral debt. Years later, when interviewed by federal archivists, one elderly woman described the atmosphere of that winter as a heaviness that made you whisper even when no one was around. A line that appears in a footnote of a forgotten WPA transcript and stands as one of the few surviving reflections that acknowledges the emotional truth of that season of reckoning. Looking back through the fractured testimonies, contradictory ledgers, and signed letters, and whispered recollections that survive from that period, one is left with the uneasy sense that the community's greatest act of violence was not the bloodshed of Election Day itself, but the collective decision to remember selectively, to sculpt the past into something more bearable and less indicting. The question of justice versus vengeance hangs unresolved over every scrap of surviving documentation. The law, in its careful euphemisms, pretended that justice had been maintained, while the enslaved, bound by chains of survival, understood that vengeance, however justified, came with a human cost that could not be absorbed by a single person nor erased by a single night of upheaval. What remains, ultimately, is the profound moral ambiguity of resistance under conditions designed to crush the human spirit. Was Elias a hero, a martyr, a reckless man, or merely a human being pushed past the outermost limits of endurance? None of the surviving accounts answer this, though all of them gesture toward the same haunting fact, that his act, whether remembered accurately or distorted beyond recognition, forced the entire county to confront the violence that had always existed beneath its genteel traditions, a violence too easily ignored when it remained contained and invisible. And so this narrative closes, not with a triumph or a clear moral lesson, but with a documentary-style question, one that cannot be resolved by the archives or the living descendants of those who survived. When a community builds its comfort on the suffering of others, what does it owe to the memory of the one person who finally refused to bear that burden quietly? And more unsettling still, is silence an act of protection or an act of complicity? The record ends before answering, leaving only the echo of its question to travel across the centuries like the slow roll of river fog, untouched, unanswerable, and waiting for each new reader to decide what justice might actually mean.